Hello, everyone, and welcome to TPS training. My name is Lewis Weber with Behavior Care. In this segment, we're going to take a look at some of the graphs and analyses that are most popular. At another training, we'll go through each of them in more detail, but today I wanted to talk about the most useful graphs and analyses, so that way you can be effective with your data more easily and share those data with other staff in your school and also with parents. So that's an important thing. And that's a question that often comes up. Which of the 30 graphs and tables and analyses should I use for sharing data with parents? We're going to talk about that. So those are the objectives for this training. I wanted to point out a little bit of a unique way of setting up TPS. This is for Oak Park, and you'll see that we've combined some academic blocks here, and we've also put in a midday conference and an end of day conference, so that way we can more directly involve students with their performance, because we want them to be responsible, right? And one can only be responsible when one is informed. And that's one way of doing that, to informing the student, as opposed to at the end of the day saying, here's how you did. We want to be able to have this midday conference. And we're also going to be recording transitions in the morning and in the afternoon. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay, little housekeeping here. I'm going to go up to this button, which is going to give us a little bit more space to display TPS, because I'm going to just show the tabs as opposed to tabs and commands on the ribbon. So what should I do? That gives me a little bit more space here. Okay, so I'm going to move to the right a little bit. I'm going to start with the G3. And for those who aren't as familiar with TPS, anytime you see three numbers like that, the one is going to be daily, the two is going to be weekly, and the three is going to be monthly and quarterly. And so G3 is particularly useful. Let's click on that, and I'm going to make this just a bit smaller so you can see uh, at least the width of it. Of course, the depth, or the length, I should say, goes down quite a bit. Now, these graphs are a little bit more complicated, and I'm going to hold off on talking about the graphs. I really just want to talk about these numbers up here. This is a really helpful, useful way to summarize a student's performance. Now, before we do that, I do want to show you these purple bars at the right here with students' names. So we're going to click on Pete Moss, and it's going to update all his data. That's the same way that you, let me try that again. Clicking on the student's name here is the same as clicking on this graph icon from the data entry tab. So both of those are going to send data to the graphs. And if you enter any more data, it won't be represented in any graph until you click on either that graph icon for Pete, which would be student 1, or if we go back to the G3 by clicking on his name here. So you just got to know that, and always click on the student's name if you don't, if you're not sure when was the last time you updated his data or her data. Okay, enough of that. Let's see what's going on here. We have uh, two tables. We have the increasing targets on the left and the decreasing targets on the right. For this year, I've also included a repetition of the day of the months, because you may just want to copy a section. So if you want to copy just the decreasing targets and paste it into a document, you can. Previously, the month ending dates were not listed here. So that's an improvement for this year. Okay, so rating, percentage of rating points, percentage of occurrence, average intensity with zeros, excuse me, without zeros, and increasing goal is 100% and decreasing goal is 0%. All right, let's see what all that means. So for each target behavior, we have a rating percentage of rating points. That is the percentage of the values or the ratings that have been entered during each of the recording blocks. So to summarize this or simplify it, we could say if the student earned all fours, if the student had a 0 to 4 rating system, or if the student was using a 0 to 3 rating system, that would mean the student earned all threes if they got 100%. And so it's like a math test where you can get partial credit for each of the problems that you do. So we say, well, how did you do? Well, for December, 87.5%. So that means that the student earned 87.5% of all of the possible points. And again, the possible points is defined by the rating system, and it summarizes the rating percentages for that month. So how many points were earned based on a 0 to 4 rating system for each recording block. So in that case, 87%. So we can see on a monthly basis, which is nice, getting out to the value of this, we get to see how the student is, the performance is improving or not, or varying from month to month. And these are month endings on the school date, the last date of the month, that's a school date. Okay. Well, let's see what we got here. We have a nice increase for November and December, pretty much across. A little bit of a drop here in September in the rating percentages. Okay, so that's just something you can talk about. And let's hop over here to percentage of rating points for decreasing targets. Now you'll note here we have 0% is the goal. And of course that makes sense when you think about it. We want for our decreasing targets the zeros to be earned as well, that is the goal, that there would be no target behavior observed for verbal aggression and physical aggression and so forth. Anything that's not a zero is going to start to bump up these percentages. If the student earned all zeros, as Pete did for December, then the rating percentage would be 0. If Pete earned all fours, it would be 100%. So these percentages operate exactly the same as these percentages. The only difference is the desired outcome. Here we want 100%, here we want 0%. Well, let's see. So we have a nice decrease of rating percentages for all, well, most went up a little bit for physical aggression of property, but they're pretty low. They're pretty low. Okay, and that's a good thing. But there's more to the story. Okay, so now let's hop back over here to the second column, occurrence. Occurrence is percentage of occurrence, and that means on a percentage basis, what is the percentage of the academic block or recording blocks when the target behavior occurred? Which means not that the student did not receive a 0, some number other than 0. So occurrence is defined by some level of performance that's not a 0. So it could be, if it's a 4-point scale, it could be a 1, 2, 3, or 4. All of those contribute equally to occurrence. Occurrence only looks at whether it happened or not. It does not evaluate the range of values. That weight goes into the rating. Here we're just looking at occurrence. Now, I started with the increasing targets, and pretty much these are going to be high. Unless the student is earning a bunch of zeros, of course we would see that here as well. These ratings would start to drop because the ratings include zeros in them. So occurrence means that there was some non-zero value, and typically we find these values to be pretty high because the student typically is earning at least a 1 on a 4-point scale for each of the increasing targets. However, if we start to see some gaps here, like we did over here, occurrence was low for responsibility at 88%, relatively speaking it was low. That means that the student, that Pete had earned a bunch of zeros for his responsibility in August of 2019. Occurrence is a more important measure for decreasing targets because zeros are the name of the game. We want their student to earn zeros for occurrence and for the ratings. We want them both to be zeros. When the student exhibits, for example, some level of verbal aggression, whether it be a level 1, 2, 3, or 4, it's going to, of course, change these ratings here. But we can look at it in terms of just how often it occurred. So 23% of all of the recording blocks for August had some level of verbal aggression. And that is very informative for the decreasing targets because it tells us how often it's occurring or not. And it strips out the rating, the contribution of the rating to that number because sometimes we just want to know how often is the student doing it. And so that's what occurrence is. It tells us how often a student is doing whatever it is that's being measured. We want to see zeros here as we do for December. And we see that the occurrence drops off uh, compared to the first month of the school year, and that would be a good thing. It increased a little bit here in November, went up to 2%. Now, currents may be low, and we would say, well, that's a good thing, but there's more to the story. That's why G3 is such a useful thing. I've already spent quite a bit of time on this. Why it's so important is because it gives us so much information. All right, let's hop back here one more time, and let's look at the intensity. Intensity is the average intensity without zeros. So when the target behavior occurred, what was the average rating? That's what intensity looks like. So we strip out the zeros because we want to know the level of the student's performance or behavior when he's doing it, not over as an overall average. So that's the important thing about intensity. It tells us the average rating without those zeros included in there. So it's a when the student is doing it, how intense or at what level is the student doing it. So as we can see, the average intensity for respect increased pretty high in December compared to earlier in the year, and that goes across most of the measures. Again, the intensity dropped off for I think, yeah, for all the increasing targets, the intensity decreased in September. So that was a challenging month for Pete. Let's now look at the decreasing target behaviors. Now, this is important because these numbers can be very low because the occurrence is only looking at the percentage of academic blocks or recording blocks when the behavior occurred. That may be a very low percentage if the student is only infrequently being verbally aggressive or physically aggressive to persons. However, the question is, and the one that's answered by intensity, when the student is aggressive, how intense is the aggression? So by stripping out the zeros and only looking at the non-zero values, we can see that the student's intensity level was a 2 on the 4-point scale for physical aggression to persons, and here it actually went up to a 3 on the 4-point scale. Now we can say, well, it's very intense when it occurs. How often does it occur? Not very often, only 0.7%, so it's not even 1% of the recording blocks. So this gives us a tremendous amount of information. Now I want to show you how to embed this in a Word document. So I'm just going to, well, actually, I'm not going to do that because it's going to change my screen. I'll do that at another time. Okay, so let's just forget about that. So as we scroll down, we see some graphs of these data. And these graphs are a little bit more complicated. I'm going to skip the graphs for the moment. Then I'm going to come down here and show you that we can also look at these same numbers on a quarterly basis, which is really handy to be able to do because we often want to review performance on a quarterly basis. I will point out something else. Here, when you are looking at determining ESY for each student, you can look at them in three different ways for each target behavior as to how the student's performance changed before the break and then after the break. So if you need to make that determination, the G3 is an excellent way to summarize that. Okay, well, that was a lot of time on G3. I'm going to just keep going on here because I want to finish this idea of how to summarize data in the most efficient way. The next stop is the D1. Now, D1, I'm going to scroll up to the top here, has a tremendous amount of information here, but I'm going to skip the first page of this. And the second page, now as I'm scrolling down, you wouldn't know it's the second page, but it is, if you go to print it, second page. And I'm going to just bring you up to the top here to show you that this student had 4,412 ratings, data points, over 70 days of data. So it gives you a good way to justify that the data are based on, or the graphs are based on a considerable amount of data. So let's take a look at what this is, because this is a great way to summarize data for parents. What this is showing is the percentage of the ratings for each of the ratings. Let me explain that a little bit. So we see that we have for respect, we have a 0 through 4 rating system. What is the percentage of all of the ratings that were collected for respect? How many of them on a percentage basis was 4? Well, 6%, 6.8% of all of the ratings collected for respect were 4s. 38% were 3s, 40% of them were 2s, 10% was a 1, and 4% of the ratings were 0s. And we can do that for each of the target behaviors. Of course, for the increasing targets, we want to see higher percentages over here. 2s and 3s are not bad, though. We should point out that for these ratings, 4 to 6% of the ratings were 0s, meaning that Pete didn't have any respect on task acceptance or responsibility. Okay, same idea, once again, for the decreasing target behaviors using the same rating system, the same concept. We just want to see the values in a different part of the graph. We want to see all of the ratings over here for the 0s. 88%, 88.9, almost 89% of all of the ratings for verbal aggression were 0s. 6% were 1s, 2% were 2s, 1%, 1.8, etc. were 3s, and 0.5% 4. So this gives you an idea of how Pete's data was collected over the 4,412 ratings. So that 4,412, that's a total of all of these. Now, if you did want to see the quantities for each of these, we could just scroll right up here and we could see how many of the ratings were rated as 4 for verbal aggression and how many ratings were rated as 3 for verbal aggression and so forth. So these graphs are coming from these percentages here, but we can look at quantities as well. So that's a nice graph to share with parents. It's page 2 of the D1. Okay, let's keep going. The AB has been updated for this year. There are 5 different tabs now. 5 different tables. The first one is just looking at the count of occurrence. How many times did a non-zero rating get recorded? Now for that, we tend not to be so interested on the increasing targets because we expect those to be high, and we had 70 days of data. So that means that these are going to be roughly approximating 70 because we expect a non-zero value in most of the recording blocks, and this recording block occurs once a day. So if there were 70 days, these are going to get close to 70. The more important measure is over here. We want to see zeros, and it tells us where, in this case, Pete is having some challenges with verbal aggression during ELA, as well as having some problems during his midday conference. And math is a challenge. Okay, and this tells us just a total on the bottom. As we scroll down, this tells me how many data points were collected during each of the recording blocks. So this is a count of data. I would like to see these numbers be reasonably close to the number that's up here, meaning 70 days of data. I would like to see 70 data points collected for each target behavior and for each recording period. So this gives us an idea of how much data has been collected. Now, if we saw some big gaps, like if we saw some 10s and 20s here, that would mean that the teacher or aide was not collecting data during these academic blocks or recording blocks. So it's just something for us to know. Okay, this table looks at the data in terms of the rating percentages. So we want to see 100% over here. We want to see 0% over here. And then we get to decide where the focus should be based on these numbers. Again, we see that ELA was particularly challenging. Here's percentage of occurrence. And then, as we had noted earlier with the G3, occurrence isn't so important for increasing targets. It's more an issue over here. So 16% of all of the rating 60% of all of the recording blocks for the midday conference had some amount of verbal aggression in it. It doesn't tell us what that level was. It just tells us that it occurred, and that's why we refer to it as occurrence. If we want to know the level, we scroll up here, and we can see on a percentage basis what that level would be. Now, we'll note here that these data here for percentage of increasing and decreasing target behavior ratings, those are based on all data, which includes zeros. Sometimes we want to see the average rating when it occurs, not including those zeros. So here's the average rating of increasing and decreasing target behaviors with the zeros excluded. And that gives us an intensity measure. And then following that, we can look at all the ratings. So we can compare these values, which include the zeros. We can compare those values to these values over here. Tremendous amount of data that is available here. And we, if we had to pick one, I would say what I like to look at is percentage of occurrence, because I want to know where the decreasing target behaviors are occurring. That's my first stop. After that, I look at percentages of increasing and decreasing targets, or I look at these two at the bottom here, which are the averages without the zeros and the averages with the zeros, all ratings. Okay, that's the A, B. We're going to look at one more series, and then we'll put a bookmark in this, so because it's going to end up getting too long. I like to look at the J2. The J2, again, we have a 1, 2, and a 3, so these are averages. Averages daily, averages weekly, averages monthly. What I like about the J2 is kind of that Goldilocks thing of the just right. We are looking at weekly data, weekly averages of all the ratings. Now there are two values here being graphed. We have the dots is the weekly average of the rating without the zeros, excuse me, with the zeros, and the X's are weekly average rating without the zeros. So with zeros for dots, without zeros, X. When they overlap, that means there are no zeros being earned for any of the ratings, such as right here. There were no zeros. When there is a difference between a dot and an X, it tells us how, not specifically how many, but the contribution or the effect is from the zeros. The larger the gap between the dot and the X, the greater the number of zeros. Now, for increasing targets, we tend to see a pretty close overlap because most of the time students earn at least a 1 on a 4-point scale. And so as long as they're earning at least a 1, then the dot and the X isn't going to separate, because the difference here between dots and X's is solely due to zeros being earned. But when we scroll down to decreasing target behaviors, we see a big difference typically, because the student, let's say Pete in this case, Pete earns mostly zeros for his decreasing target behaviors. Those are reflected by the dots meaning all data, including the zeros. When Pete is verbally aggressive and we strip out those zeros, here's the average of his verbal aggression when he exhibits verbal aggression. So it takes the zeros out of the average so that we can see the intensity when the behavior occurs. Now, when there's no X, like from here to here, it's because there were no um, non-zero data. There were no other ratings, so it just skips over that. Being that Pete earned only zeros for physical aggression to property for this series of weeks right here, there are no non-zero ratings. So it just TPS just connects the lines between the X's where there were some or was some level of physical aggression to property. So it tells us how often there is a target behavior that is a non-zero level by the quantity of X's that we see. Here we see more X's because verbal aggression is a more frequently occurring target behavior. Okay. And so when we go to look at this page in its entirety, let's see if I can get the right magnification here. We have a nice display of the increasing and decreasing target behaviors. And I'll also note at the top here, kind of making this go in and out, we have the phase changes being listed. Now it doesn't have a line because phase changes could occur somewhere in that week. We don't know when that is on a weekly data point, but we do list it at the top with the date. And when you go to copy this, if you just click on an area that's close by, and you can just kind of select. I'm holding my finger down. Of course, you don't know that, but I'm holding my index finger down and I'm selecting these graphs, and you can select them and paste them as a picture into your Word document. And I'll show you that another time. Okay, so there you have it. We looked at the weekly averages. We looked at the analysis by academic block, and we looked at the D1, which is summarizing the quantity of each kind of rating, and we looked at G3. So those are the graphs I go to when I want to summarize a student's performance. Now, there are many other graphs and analyses, and sometimes I use those. They're there for one to use when there's something important to say about them, and we'll cover those at another time. But this will be a place we put the bookmark. So these are the most useful graphs, and I encourage you to become familiar with them. And if you have any questions about these things, feel free to drop me a line on email, lewis.weber@sarasota.countyschools.net. Again, thanks so much for being a part of this training. Lewis Weber with Behavior Care, signing off.